We're just over time starting. Thank you for your patience. I'd like to welcome you to this first side event hosted by Dementia Alliance International in the history of dementia at this 12th session of the Convention of State Parties on the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. My name is Kate Swaffer and I am the Chair, CEO and one of 8 founders of Dementia Alliance International. I'd first like to acknowledge and thank our co-hosts, the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the Australian Government, the International Disability Alliance, Alzheimer's Disease International, the Global Rehabilitation Alliance, Human Rights Watch, and the World Hospice and Palliative Care Alliance. We are very grateful for their support. This year, Dementia Alliance International is celebrating 5 years of existence, and at this side event we recognise the progress that has been made by people with dementia in the advancement of rights of persons with dementia, as persons also living with acquired disabilities. The overarching theme is of social inclusion and health, which are 2 of the determinants of well-being, both of which are being systemically denied to people with dementia around the world, including in the developed countries. We will hear from an eminent list of speakers on the rights of persons with any type of disability, including dementia, to full and equal access to the CRPD, and specifically on the right to rehabilitation and to universal health care. It is a great honour to have such an eminent list of speakers, and I thank them for their generosity for giving us their time to share their expertise today. Our focus is on dementia as a disability and our rights to social inclusion and to healthcare, including rehabilitation. The information book provided today, which is at your tables, has a more detailed biography of our speakers, who I'd now like to acknowledge and introduce to you. Ms. Catalina de Vandas Aguilar is the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. She is a lawyer by training and a human rights advocate, and has worked extensively on disability rights and inclusive development for the past 20 years, including with the World Bank, the United Nations Department for Economic and Social Affairs, and international donor organisations that supported the work of organisations of persons with disabilities to promote the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Ms. de Vandas Aguilar was previously part of the disability rights movement at national, regional and international level, and continues to work closely with organisations of persons with disabilities. Her work priorities as a Special Rapporteur include socio-economic inclusion, the promotion of full citizenship of persons with disabilities, and embracing diversity, understanding that persons with disabilities are part of human diversity. She is married, a mother of 3 daughters, and has spina bifida. Christine Telker is from Vernon, British Columbia, Canada, and at 59 says her sense of humour has grown since her diagnosis of dementia. She is also a board member of Dementia Alliance International and previously worked for the Interior Health Authority for 13 years in various sites, including in dementia care and end of life. Anthony Datine is the Advisor on Disability and Rehabilitation at the Pan American Organisation and the World Health Organization. A major focus of his work centres around health equity for persons with disabilities. Prior to his work at PAHO, Anthony was employed by Humanity and Inclusion, undertaking roles in Afghanistan, France and Washington. Jans Monsbakken is immediate past president in Rehabilitation International. He was president of Rehabilitation International Global from 2012 to 2016. He is also president of RI Norway. He was deputy president of RI Europe from 2008 to 2011. He is treasurer of the Global Rehabilitation Alliance since 2018, when this organisation was formally established. Arlene Pietranton serves as Chief Executive Officer of the American Speech Language Hearing Association, the professional scientific and credentialing association for over 204,000 audiologists, speech-language pathologists, speech, language and hearing scientists, and student and international personnel. Dementia affects more than 50 million people globally, and there is a new diagnosis every 3 seconds in the world. It has been recognised as a condition causing acquired cognitive disabilities by the World Health Organization for many years, and the time is now that healthcare professionals, researchers and civil society recognise and support dementia this way. People with dementia are isolated, stigmatised and discriminated against on a daily basis. I know this from personal experience, having been diagnosed with a rare form of young-onset dementia at 49. The enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health and to equal and accessible inclusion are two of the fundamental human rights of every human being. The CRPD reaffirms this right for persons with disabilities and member supports, and they are often denied inclusion and are being systematically denied healthcare following their diagnosis. The time is now for the rhetoric of governments and all others to turn into concrete action to improve the quality of life for people with dementia and our families. Many of the articles of the CRPD are being violated by the lack of services, lack of health care and the isolation and stigma and discrimination that people experience. In 2015, the conclusion of the OECD report addressing dementia, the OECD response was that people with dementia receive the worst care of any disease in the developed world. This is indeed partly why we are here today and why DAI believes there must be nothing about us without us, especially as we're being left behind currently in the 2030 agenda. Before I give the floor to our speakers, if you would like to share the slides from today, to share the slides with today, or subscribe to our news, please sign the delegates attendance list and we will contact you. And I may kindly remind our speakers have a limit of 8 minutes for their presentations so that we are able to take some interventions from the floor. I'd like now to give the floor to Ms. Catalina de Vandes Aquila, who I thank sincerely for making time for our important side event today, especially in her very busy schedule.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to the Dementia Alliance International for inviting me to participate in this important event, and also to all the co-sponsors of this event. This is an issue that is of high relevance to my mandate, first of all for its implications with many of the fundamental rights that are included in the Convention, as I will mention in the presentation, but also because I'm currently working on a report that will be presented in the General Assembly this fall on the rights of older persons with disabilities, and one aspect that it's going to be reflected in the report is the situation of persons with dementia. So in principle, when we, of course, talk about longer lifespans, it's normally associated with an increased prevalence of chronic illness and impairment as people age. And this includes, of course, the physical impairments, but also, of course, dementia. And that in interaction with the many barriers that are in our societies might result indeed in disabilities. Often, however, we are far more prepared to adjust now to the physical impairments that we might acquire through age. We are not equally prepared to address the needs of persons that might require other types of support due to their different challenges acquired through life. So we have what I will call a global burden of obstacles that hinders the implementation of the right to all persons to have access to the highest attainable standards of health, including, of course, the dominance of a biomedical model. And I think that this is quite important to stress from my point of view. We have made important advancements in achieving the understanding that the medical model is wrong, but for certain groups of persons with disabilities. Not all are benefiting from that, and in some cases, and in particularly I think in cases of persons with psychosocial disabilities or persons that have dementia, there is still a very prevalent medical model to respond to their needs, and that as the medical model does, just nullifies the rest of the existence of the person. And of course, this contributes, this very medicalized approach has contributed to stigma, exclusion, neglect, coercion, and abuse of persons with disabilities, particularly those, as I was mentioned, with psychosocial intellectual disabilities, with dementia, with autism. And this has, and I think this is also very important, limited the policy responses that are provided to these persons, and it narrows the responses in the mental health area, for instance, but also in the ways in which psychosocial support is provided to those that might seek it, or any other sorts of support. And this is, for example, it's clear that public expenditure are mostly directed to inpatient care and specialized medical services, including in psychiatric facilities and residential institutions, while community-based and non-coercive support services are barely funded. Persons with dementia, of course, are at particular risk of facing grave human rights violations, in which we have the problems of their high support needs and communication difficulties that are not being fully addressed. Stigma and stereotypes around dementia are particularly pervasive. Several studies have shown that negative perceptions and attitudes towards persons with dementia are prevalent within service provided and the general populations, and particularly it has been assumed that this population possess weak or even no agency, and the sole diagnosis, for instance, of Alzheimer's disease or dementia is often the justification of denial of the exercise of fundamental rights. They face a specific human rights violation, including the denial of autonomy and legal capacity, of course, institutionalization, lack of community support, and different forms of violence and abuse. And they're often administered, they often receive neuroleptics and other psychotropic drugs as a form of chemical restraint. Involuntary interventions are prevalent, and of course these interventions are invasive, painful, irreversible. We have, and we mentioned, electroconvulsive therapies, psychosurgeries, involuntary sterilizations, among others. These practices are not only contrary to the right to health, but also to the right to be free of torture and ill treatment. And little attention, of course, is paid, and this, I believe, is quite important, to persons with younger onset of dementia who experience ageism due to a common misperception that dementia is only an older person's condition. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities represents an opportunity to strengthen the rights-based approach to dementia. This human rights-based approach rejects the view that persons with disabilities are objects of charity, treatment, welfare, and protection, and instead affirms that persons with disabilities are subjects of human rights. According to the conventions, states must adopt a human rights-based approach on legislation and policies and repeal legislations that allow for the denial of legal capacity, that allows for institutionalization, and that allows for involuntary treatment on the basis of disability. States should also ensure the access of persons with disabilities to a wide range of community-based support services and arrangements, support in decision-making, assisted living arrangements, and assistive devices and technology. It is important to continue to develop good practice as well as to address structural aspects such as how mental health laws normalize coercion, lack of flexibility in service, lack of human resources, and prejudice. There is increasing evidence of the lack of effectiveness there is increasing evidence of the effectiveness of non-coercive interventions. In closing, I would like to stress that in the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Leaving No One Behind of the Agenda 2030, it is a great opportunity that we have to advance the rights of persons with dementia. They are still being seen as patients that need to be cured or controlled or just cared by others. In this process, it is fundamental to promote the participation of persons with dementia in all decision-making processes related to implementation of the rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. de Vandes Aguilar. We understand you do have to leave now, and thank you again for making the time to be here today. I first apologise for not introducing Bethany Brown from Human Rights Watch. Bethany Brown researches older people's rights at Human Rights Watch. Before joining Human Rights Watch, she worked on policy and advocacy for older people with Help Age International and Help Age USA, where she guided research, training and work at the UN. Her work has taken her to Chile, Haiti and Iraq, Kurdistan. She has co-authored a book as well as articles and chapters on older people's human rights. Bethany holds a bachelor's degree from Barnard College and a law degree from American University, Washington College of Law. Apologies for not first introducing you. I'd now like to give the floor to DAI board member Christine Telker. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for attending the DAI Side Event and the opportunity to represent people with dementia. This presentation begins with an overview of dementia, dementia as a disability, and global statistics. The continued medicalization of dementia and refusal by healthcare professionals, civil society, and advocacy organizations to see and support dementia as a disability is a breach of our rights. The World Health Organization stated in 2017 that dementia is the leading cause of disability and dependence in older persons, although currently not one country that we know of provides disability assessment or disability support to people diagnosed with dementia. Dementia is recognized as a group of syndromes or conditions causing cognitive and other disabilities and are now recognized this way by the World Health Organization. Worldwide, there are an estimated 50 million people living with dementia. There is one new diagnosis globally every 3.2 seconds. More than 130 types or causes of dementia. Alzheimer's makes up 50 to 70%. Dementia is a terminal, progressive, chronic illness that causes cognitive disabilities. There is no cure, no disease-modifying drugs. There are some treatments for some types of Alzheimer's that may slow the progression for up to 2 years. For people living with dementia are missing out not only on universal health care, but on access to the CRPD and disability support. The United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a milestone document in the history of human rights. However, even though people with dementia retain the same rights as all others in society, there has been little advocacy for these rights. The CRPD is relevant to persons with dementia because it defines persons with disabilities as persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. There can be little doubt that persons with dementia are addressed by this definition and are intended beneficiaries of this convention. This charter also reflects the standards already set by the United Nations and other international instruments by recognizing the need to promote and protect the human rights of all persons with disabilities, including those who require more intensive support, that persons with disabilities must be guaranteed the fullest possible realization of their human rights, including an opportunity to participate in and contribute to society, and where necessary, with the highest attainable standard of care. That discrimination against any person on the basis of disability is a violation of the inherent dignity and worth of the human person. People with dementia are asking for a social model of disability support and care. The CRPD also adopts a social model of disability, and its preamble recognizes that disability is an evolving concept and that disability results from the interaction between persons with impairments and attitudinal and environmental barriers that hinders their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. However, We are currently even being denied access to post-diagnostic support, including universal health care. The WHO Global Action Plan for a Public Health Approach to Dementia, adopted unanimously at the World Health Assembly in Geneva in May 2017, human rights, empowerment, and accountability are characterized as three cross-cutting principles. However, since the adoption of the CRPD by the UN General Assembly, these principles cannot be realized without full commitment to the general principles and 33 substantive articles of the CRPD and its optional protocol. DAI works to ensure all people with any type of disability are included in the CRPD and other conventions. It is now 2019, and people with dementia are still being left behind in the 2030 agenda. Of those countries who have ratified the CRPD, no one have yet implemented it for people with dementia, nor considered the WHO's Global Disability and Development Action Plan, its revised guidelines for community-based rehabilitation, and its new equality rights indication for mental health, which includes dementia, but must be considered in all plans for dementia or full access to the CRPD and other conventions. The report from the WHO First Ministerial Conference on Global Action Against Dementia made a number of calls to action. Included in the final call to action, three remarks made by Kate Swaffer were that we have a human right to a more ethical pathway of care, being treated with the same human rights as everyone else under the Disability Discrimination Act and UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, that research does not only focus on a cure, but on our pre- and post-diagnostic care and on pre- and post-prevention, including rehabilitation. Regardless of dementia falling within the definition of disability within domestic and international law, people with dementia continue to face a number of challenges in their rights being upheld. Too often, many of the stakeholders and policymakers do not even see the need for those of us advocating for our rights, and this can partly be because the symptoms are often hidden or invisible until we become more advanced in the disease process. The public misperception of dementia, of people with dementia, is that we are older and we go straight to late stage upon diagnosis and are unable to function. Focusing on the symptoms of dementia as acquired disabilities in the same way we would if someone had disabilities after a stroke or head injury is the future. The many misperceptions and myths about dementia mean that those diagnosed often have great difficulty in protecting their own rights. Society in general has not seen nor been used to people with dementia being capable of having a voice, and people with dementia have been shut away and forgotten in society until recently. Stigma, isolation, and discrimination against people with dementia is a predominant feature of our experience. We are treated with less respect, less dignity, less compassion than other members of society. Collectively, DAI realized we had to struggle with multiple challenges, not only access to health care, but also many based on social stigma and discrimination related to changes in our cognitive ability. We began to speak up about the unfair, hurtful, dehumanizing injustice imposed upon people with dementia. The task of speaking out against people causing us harm is complicated by the fact that many of them are well-intentioned medical staff, service providers, advocacy organizations, and close family and friends who are also often our care partners, but who may be ignorant, unwilling, or unable to engage with us as equals. Although we are grateful for support from others, we have sometimes been demonized for needing it, but ironically, we are also being demonized by some for not needing it. The misguided underestimations of our potential continue to create oppressive and humiliating barriers to our full engagement in society. Perhaps the worst myth we experience is that others expect that people with dementia go from diagnosis immediately to end stage. This myth is endemic, and DAI co-founder Kate Swaffer is regularly quoted saying, there is a systemic and gross underestimation of the capacities of all people with dementia, even in the later stages. Members of DAI and others with dementia globally are systematically proving this to be true and will continue to individually or collectively demand a rights-based approach to dementia with full and equal access to the CRPD and other conventions. People with dementia are being denied access to universal health care and so far are being systematically denied proactive disability support and equal and full access to the CRPD. We sincerely hope this first DAI side event will help change this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your powerful speech, Christine. I'd now like to give the floor to Anthony Dutteen.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's Bethany's slides that are up. Do you want to switch to Bethany first?
Sorry, yes,
no problem.
Bethany, sorry.
Goodbye, everyone.
I apologise. I was cut and pasting my running sheet this morning at 3 a.m. and got it slightly confused. So I'll now give the floor to Ms. Bethany Brown. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you to Dementia Alliance International for putting together this wonderful opportunity to discuss such important issues and to speak with such a powerful voice. Human Rights Watch is the first mainstream human rights organization to develop a dedicated program of work on the rights of older people. And I'm excited to be here with you today to talk about our research on rights violations against older people living with dementia. Last year, we documented widespread inappropriate use of psychotropic drugs in older people in U.S. nursing facilities, almost always among people with dementia and often without informed consent. In our research, we talked with people like Lena in California, whose mother, Lucinda, has dementia. She's 88. She experienced a painful urinary tract infection, pulmonary embolism, and pneumonia while on psychotropic drugs in a nursing facility. She was crying out in pain. The facility responded to those cries, to those screams, by administering more drugs to keep her quiet until she looked so unwell that Lena took her to the hospital for treatment. Lena told us that if she were in such inarticulable pain like her mother had been, she would scream too. And I think that we all would. The CRPD committee has condemned the use of restraints against people with disabilities. Countries are supposed to prohibit the use of chemical restraints to silence people and control their behavior. As Human Rights Watch's researcher on older people's rights, I chose to work on chemical restraints because it's a huge problem. It is quietly killing older people, mostly people with dementia, and robbing them of conscious life, hidden away from the rest of society in institutions. Sometimes these drugs are called chemical straitjackets. But I think that that's an understatement. They're used like a straitjacket and a gag and a blindfold and a billy club, all in one pill. And some classes of drugs are particularly dangerous. In clinical trials, they almost doubled the risk of death in 10 weeks for people over the age of 60 taking them with dementia. I want those of you who are not so familiar with this topic to come away knowing two things. It's a big problem. 16% of residents in the United States are given these drugs inappropriately. That's 1 in 6. That's over 179,000 people a week in the US alone. It's a worldwide problem. We're currently conducting research in this area in Australia. Secondly, I want you to know that it doesn't have to be this way. When a person is visibly upset, they're expressing an unmet need, and that need can be supported. People with dementia can and must be supported, and the government can and must enforce prohibitions on the use of chemical restraints to silence people. Our report, They Want Docile, How Nursing Homes in the U.S. Over-Medicate People with Dementia, there's a summary over there by the door, was released in February of 2018 with the work of a brilliant fellow. Together as a team, we did over 300 interviews in 109 facilities in 6 states across the United States. We interviewed residents, family members, staff, directors of nursing, pharmacists, and others. And all of this, while in line with international human rights law, the U.S. law and regulations prohibit the use of psychotropic medicines as chemical restraints for the convenience of a facility. Nursing facilities are required to have an adequate medical basis for initiating the use of these drugs. The drug's sedative effect, rather than any anticipated medical benefit, too often drives the high prevalence of this use in people with dementia. These drugs alter consciousness. They can adversely affect a person's ability to interact with others, and they can also make it a lot easier for understaffed facilities with direct care workers who are inadequately trained in dementia support to manage the people who live there. In many facilities, inadequate staff numbers and training make it nearly impossible to take that individualized, comprehensive approach that people are entitled to. Many nursing facilities in the U.S. have staffing levels well below what experts consider the minimum needed to provide appropriate support. This means knowing who people are, checking for pain and sources of what might be upsetting them if they're exhibiting signs of being upset, and supporting them in positive and individualized ways. Nursing facility staff, individuals living in facilities, their families, long-term care advocates, and others told Human Rights Watch that these drugs are used sometimes almost by default for the convenience of the facility to control people whose behavior does not fit within the facility's definition of acceptable behavior. We also talked with facility managers who eliminated their use of chemical restraints. And what they told us was that they actually didn't need to add any more support staff when they had done that, because they gave people the ability to manage some of their own needs again, things like eating and drinking, etc., without support. So one of my favorite ways to think about human rights is the way that we govern the relationship between individuals and governments. And I want to talk now about what the government's role is. They've prohibited chemical restraints in the U.S., but effective regulation includes ensuring that facilities are inspected and face meaningful sanctions for noncompliance. They have to enforce their own rules. Having complaints mechanisms are not enough. Many individuals in nursing facilities depend entirely on the institution's good faith and have no realistic avenues to help or safety when that good faith is violated. Many people don't have family or friends there to support them. Think about that. If I've been put on these drugs and I don't have anyone visiting me to notice that I'm sleeping all the time and not eating and not drinking, it's like a tree falling in the forest with nobody there to hear it. If I'm too drugged up to open my eyes or walk or eat, then I'm not going to be seeking help and calling a complaints line. Our research found that the government regulator here in the U.S. is not using its full authority to address this violation. Recently, in fact, it's moving in the opposite direction, limiting the severity of financial penalties. Our quantitative analysis of the fines assessed in all states between 2014 and 2016 found that 80% were less than $10,000 for this violation. 20% were between $10,000 and $100,000, and only a tiny fraction of penalties were for amounts beyond that. So we're continuing to push for change. This report has been written about widely in the press. The House Ways and Means Committee, which controls spending, referenced our report directly in calling the regulator to account for allowing these abuses to continue. Our report found that vast numbers of nursing facility residents are getting drugs that many do not need, do not want, and that put their lives and quality of life at risk. An industry that's entrusted to provide support and paid billions of public and private dollars to do so cannot justify compounding the vulnerabilities, challenges, and loss that older people too often experience in institutions. Thank you.
Thank you for the excellent presentation, Bethany. It's fairly sobering to hear, actually. I'd now like to give the floor to Ms. Arlene Petranton.
Thank you, Kate. Good morning, everybody. And oh, thank you. I will. Thank you for that, Kate. Yep. We'll tag team on the slides, advancing them. Yep. So thank you to Kate and to Dementia Alliance International for organizing this morning's side event, and congratulations on the milestone of the 5th anniversary. If we could go to the next slide, please. It's a pleasure to be able to be here this morning serving on this panel and to highlight information about speech-language hearing disabilities that persons with dementia may often and in fact usually experience, but that can sometimes be less visible and hence oftentimes overlooked. So on this slide, just a word or two about the American Speech-Language Hearing Association. As Kate said in her introduction, that's the organization with which I work. We are not a global organization with over 7,000 languages in the world. That would be an impossible task to take on. However, we do strive to actively and responsibly engage in a number of networks on a national, regional, and global basis, including the capacity building work that we've been doing in recent years with and through the Pan American Health Organization, by which we are recognized. I believe the current term now is non-state actor. Is that correct? Previously NGO. If we can go to the next slide, please, Kate. So to frame this topic of cognition and communication relative to persons with dementia, I want to remind us when we talk about communication, we're talking about one's speech, language, and hearing skills. And we need to also recognize that cognition and communication are highly interrelated. In fact, many of our cognitive functions or skills are language-based. So think about that. Think about self-talk as you are talking yourself through a problem solving or you're trying to remember something. So much of what we do cognitively is in fact language-based. You can see on that slide different types of communication impairment may be related to the ability to express oneself or to understand what's being said or what you're reading. It may be the pragmatics, the appropriateness of things like turn taking. It could be the speech fluency or the clarity of what you're saying. Ultimately, it leads to a decrease in function and independence. So if we can go to the next slide, please, Kate. I also want to acknowledge that we know that swallowing disorders are a very frequent occurrence for individuals who are living with dementia, and in fact those can be life-threatening. But for today's purposes, with the time that we have, we're just going to focus on cognition and communication. Christine pointed out very clearly for us how those factors, considerations of disabilities related to cognition or communication are acknowledged and addressed in both the principles and some of the specific articles of the CRPD. We can go on to the next slide, please. So to illustrate a bit more specifically what these disabilities may look like, it can result in deficits in attention, the ability to divide one's attention, to be involved perhaps in cooking something on the stove while needing to chop and do some food prep on the side. It might be in focusing one's attention, not being distracted by things happening in the room around you while you're participating in a conversation. It could be related to learning and memory, the ability to learn new information, to remember the name and the purpose of a new medication, or to remember old information, family details, and personal history. It can be related to reasoning and executive functioning, the ability to prioritize, plan, make decisions, perceptual abilities, the ability to navigate in space, simple things like finding your way home after a walk. Obviously, language, understanding what others are saying, and the ability to express your thoughts, ideas, preferences, and wishes so that you can be in charge of your independence and how your life is being lived. If we can go to the next slide, please. Want to also make sure we don't overlook hearing. There's a very high comorbidity of hearing loss and dementia. And we know that hearing loss is something that is a potentially modifiable risk factor. Most hearing loss can benefit from assistive technology. Obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, but oftentimes individuals with dementia may need additional support to be able to use and benefit from a hearing aid, but it can be used to mediate a hearing loss. If we can go on to the next slide, please. When talking about hearing, we also need to keep in mind that there is quite a bit of data that does confirm for us the benefits of intervention related to hearing loss that is beneficial in helping folks to be able to remain engaged. That mitigates against depression and isolation, and maintain a high function of cognitive and communicative ability. Next slide, please. We also need to be mindful of the relationship between hearing loss and risks of falls. There's research that shows us that there's nearly 1.5 times increase in the odds of a fall for every 10 decibels of a hearing loss. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with how sound volume is measured, a 10 decibel difference is not huge. It might be something on the order of the difference of saying today is Thursday versus today is Thursday. So there's a bit of a difference in the volume, but it's not significant. However, the risk for fall certainly is a big difference. And we do know, again, from data that persons with dementia who have a history of falls are 5 times more likely to be institutionalized. Next slide, please. So just to briefly talk about the kind of speech-language hearing services that can benefit individuals with dementia, we know that they tend to fall into these 4 groupings. The identification of the person's status, needs, and capacity to stabilize or enhance their functional skills. Intervention to capitalize on those strengths and to mitigate the vulnerabilities with a focus on functional activities that are meaningful to each person. Advising the individual and their family members and caregivers. Christine pointed out to us, sometimes those relationships can involve some tension and the opportunity to help better align how to maximize independent function. And helping to inform other professionals, payors, and legislators, as has also been pointed out. Let's go to the next slide. So, as I think has already been mentioned, early intervention is incredibly important. Being able to engage a person as early as possible when she or he is able to actively practice and habitualize strategies to minimize decline and to sustain his or her highest level of function. Let's go on to the next slide. Obviously, I hope it's obvious, the goal of any kind of intervention is to help that individual to maximize their quality of life. Next slide. Treatment needs to be both functional and person-centered. Needs to be based upon the things that are most important to that individual in terms of what they enjoy doing or what they need to be able to do. The next slide. So treatment approaches typically will fall into one of these 3 ways, 3 categories. Could be compensatory, using environmental modifications or memory aids, but something that will help the individual to be able to function at their highest level. It might be restorative. I mentioned earlier using hearing aids or other kinds of assistive technology, and it might be advising, helping the individual and the people in their life, their family members, their caregivers, to better align on strategies that will help to maximize independence. It could be something as simple as advising folks of the importance of eye contact when you're speaking to one another and not assuming that you can mention something in passing as you walk by somebody. So just to wrap up, I know this is brief and I know it's quick, but I hope it's helpful to further highlight and illustrate one of the realities that happens, something that is a reality for virtually everybody who is living with dementia, and that is the concomitant speech, language, hearing disabilities, and the opportunity to be able to offer some intervention and support to help maximize the individual's independence for as long as possible. I have some flyers here that I'll be happy to make available at the end of this side event. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Arlene. Our next speaker, I'd like to give the floor to Jans Mondbakken, please.
Thank you very much. First of all, I like to thank the organizers, the Dementia Alliance, for inviting me to speak here. Secondly, I will also congratulate you with all the hard work you have done during only 5 years. You have already mentioned to be an important actor in the world scene of dementia. Bringing me to also a personal experience with dementia, because both my mother and my father got dementia diagnosed before they died. And of course, I could have made a presentation on the experience to be a son of people with dementia. But this is not the time and the place for doing that, so I will leave that for another occasion. I have been asked to speak about the rights for rehabilitation for everybody, and I will put my main emphasis on, you're blathering a little bit too quick on the slides. Could you go back to the next one? Yeah. I will use most of my time to speak a little bit about the new organization which is developed, called the Global Rehabilitation Alliance. And of course, we are very happy that the Dementia Alliance is one of the members of this organization. Next. The background for establishing this Global Rehabilitation Alliance was that the WHO in February 2017 called for a meeting which had the title Rehabilitation 2030, a call for action. The background for doing that is that it's a huge unmet rehabilitation need around the world. Demand for rehabilitation services will continue to increase in light of demographic trends. Rehabilitation is an essential part of the continuum of care, which starts with promotion, prevention, treatment, and rehabilitation. And there is an urgent need for concrete global action by all relevant stakeholders to scale up quality rehabilitation. That was the conclusion from the WHO meeting in Geneva in February 2017. Next. Based on inputs during the conference, there was an agreement that some people would like to start to work to establish a new global organization. And that was later named the Global Rehabilitation Alliance. We were 4 people working in this process, of course in very close connection with WHO and Alarcos Scienza. It took us about 1 year to come to the stage that we were able to call for the first founding meeting of this organization. And the alliance was founded to unify the body for rehabilitation stakeholders to work together to ensure better rehabilitation services in the world. We will be a strategic partner to the WHO, and its prioritizing will be guided by the initiative of the the Rehabilitation 2030, a call for ally action. You can take the next one. Now you can see the list of members of the organization by June 2019. It's in total 19 global member organizations in this alliance at the moment. It's all the main health professional organizations, but it's also like motivation, it's CBR, CBM, Light for the World, and other Red Cross and other organizations that had also joined us. And the picture up there is from the founding meeting in Geneva in 2018. Next. The long-term goals of this organization is to ensure that there will be a side event on rehabilitation at the World Health Assembly. Hopefully that will take place next year. Building up to getting a WHO resolution on rehabilitation 2020 or 2021. We are in a close discussion with WHO on this issue. We will also like to see that WHO will create an action plan on rehabilitation. And last but not least, our long-time goal is to have a UN resolution on rehabilitation, which means that this global alliance has the ultimate goal to take rehabilitation from Geneva and move it to New York and to the General Assembly. Next. Of course, we work related to the good instruments that UN has created, and of course we are working on the UN CRPD and specifically on the next slide, which is Article 26 on habilitation and rehabilitation. Due to timing here, I will not quote all the sentences in the resolution, because most of the people here know the convention so well, so I will not use time on that. But it states very clearly in Article 26 that the states parties have a very strong, has to have a very strong commitment on building up rehabilitation services to all people and put them into all programs. And it's a long way to go. It's a long journey before we are at that point. Next. And of course, bringing rehabilitation from Geneva, which takes care of health and health issues on behalf of the World Health Organization, the UN, and to bring it to New York, it's of utmost important that we link the SDGs to rehabilitation. And if you take the next slide, we are on our way to produce a position paper or a policy framework on this issue. And we will call this one the role of rehabilitation for the realization of human rights and inclusive development. And here we are linking the SDGs to rehabilitation. Of course, goal number 3, which is about health and well-being, is a very important goal in that respect. But many other SDGs are also linked to rehabilitation and rehabilitation services. The paper that we are working on will be published most likely in connection to the next WHO meeting that will take place on rehabilitation in Geneva in early July. So I will inform everyone when we can release this paper for reading for everyone, where we put this into context. Next. The recommendations we have on this paper is to improve access to rehabilitation services for all, enable the participation of persons with disability, patients and rehabilitation professionals in planning, implementation, monitoring and evaluation of policies and programs on rehabilitation, contribute to the effective and independent monitoring of rehabilitation facilities and programs, advance research and production of evidence on the barriers to the cost of rehabilitation, and to promote implementation of the community-based rehabilitation programs. To end up my speech, that rehabilitation is not about a medical model. Rehabilitation is about functioning. I think there's a huge misunderstanding in many places in the world and many societies that rehabilitation is based on a medical model. No, that's not the case. Rehabilitation is a holistic approach to mankind. And it's both on the physical side, the social side, the psychological side, and the spiritual side. So by this, I will conclude my presentation, and I wish the Dementia Alliance all the best for the important work in the future. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jans. I'd now like to give the floor to Anthony.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be here, and thank you to the Dementia Alliance International. When I start with a D, I always think disability first, but no, Dementia Alliance International for inviting the WHO to this event. And I'm going to focus on something that Christine touched on during her talk, and that's the WHO Quality Rights Tool. So Christine gave a really nice overview of a lot of the things that the WHO have done, and this is one of the very practical tools that we've launched and we're working on that has a lot of implications for the dementia agenda. In essence, the Quality Rights Initiative is the global response to promoting access to quality of care and promoting human rights for people with psychosocial, intellectual, and cognitive disabilities, including people with dementia. We've heard from all of the presenters and the testimonies from you, Christine, from Bethany, about the violations and discrimination that people with dementia face. We know that there is violence, there is abuse and neglect in social care facilities. We know people with dementia face disempowering messages by providers that take away any hope, dignity, and that they should not have any goals for the future. They'll not be able to keep their job, finish their studies. They need to start winding down their activities, and that their lives as they know it will significantly deteriorate. And we know that people with dementia are often severely restricted from having control over their own lives and making decisions for themselves. So it's in this context that the Quality Rights Initiative was created in order to push forward a human rights approach on all issues affecting people with cognitive, psychosocial, and intellectual disabilities. Next slide, please. So the Quality Rights Tool works in several different areas. Firstly, to build capacity and combat stigma and discrimination to promote human rights. Secondly, to create community-based services and support that respect and promote human rights and person-centered approach. Thirdly, support civil society movements and empower people with lived experience, including people with dementia, to conduct advocacy and influence policymaking. And fourthly, working with governments to reform policy and law in line with the CRPD and other international human rights standards. And these are not four standalone areas. They're all interconnected, and they're all areas that need to be addressed in order to provide responsive, appropriate, and quality services that support people with dementia, and that the services that people want to use and find helpful. Next slide, if I could, please. So the quality rights are modules that are interrelated and work in a systematic way to build knowledge, improve attitudes, and develop new skills to promote person-centered, human rights-oriented practices. And they're all grounded in the CRPD, and they're all targeting everybody. People with dementia, family members of people with dementia, policymakers, health professionals, social service professionals, anybody is able to access these tools, and that's a really important part of that. The core modules include human rights, mental health, disability and human rights, recovery and the right to health in mental health and social services, legal capacity and the right to decide in mental health and social services, and mental health and social services that are free from coercion, violence, and abuse. And then there's some specialized modules as well, including recovery practices for mental health and well-being, supported decision-making and advanced planning, strategies to end seclusion and restraint. And the WHO has conducted evaluations in these materials, and it's shown major attitudinal and practice change both in pre and post assessments across a variety of those stakeholder groups that I mentioned before. And they've all, and this is extremely important, been developed in collaboration with more than 100 national and international actors, including organizations of people with disabilities, including Dementia Alliance International, including NGOs, people with lived experience, family and care partners, mental health professionals, and several members of the CRPD committee. Next slide, if I could, please. No worries. So we are very aware that the modules, in the form that they take as a face-to-face training, will not be scaled up to the level that they are required. So the WHO is now developing e-modules to do virtual learning in order to be accessible more globally and to a greater audience. The key features include short lessons and quizzes, game features like end of challenges and accumulating stars, discussion forums, and then gaining certificates at the end. I should point out this is not open around the world at the moment. WHO is doing a strategic rollout in certain countries to test this for its relevance and use, but keep watching this space on that. Next slide, please. The third area is developing WHO guidance to strengthen the voice and actions of people with lived experiences. There's 2 peer support modules that provide guidance on setting up, firstly, individualized peer support, and secondly, peer support groups within services. And then 2 modules around setting up and operating civil society organizations and conducting effective advocacy campaigns to integrate human rights into mental health services. And again, these have been developed in collaboration with people with lived experience, civil society, and others with relevant experience. Next slide, please. Fourthly, our quality rights assessment toolkit being used extensively. It outlines standards to be achieved in mental health and social services and helps guide countries on how to measure the standards. They're based on the CRPD and cover issues related to quality of care and human rights, including issues covered in the training materials mentioned earlier, such as legal capacity, informed consent to treatment, and so on. The toolkit can be used in the full range of services being provided, including home-based outreach support services through to social care homes. There's an accompanying module on improving transforming services that we've developed to directly address the quality and human rights gaps identified. Next slide, please. New materials in development, in the process of developing good practice guide without coercion. Good practice guide on human rights, person-centered and recovery-oriented human-based services that operate without coercion, responsive to people's needs. Next slide, please. And new work around checklists and guidance for countries on a range of key policy issues, including national policies and action plans, including people with psychosocial, intellectual, cognitive disabilities, community-based services, strategies for deinstitutionalization, and legislation promoting CRPD rights. Next slide. That was a very rapid overview of the Quality Rights tool, probably a 45-minute talk in 7 minutes. There's all of the information on the WHO website if you look up Quality Rights on the WHO website. And on the next slide are the 2 leads at the WHO, Natalie and Michelle, who couldn't be here today to present, who are very happy to take any other specific inquiries you might have. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anthony. You did very well in 8 minutes. I would first like to especially thank our speakers for giving us their time and their considerable expertise today. I would like to thank you, the floor, for attending to support this event. It's very important for Dementia Alliance International to have held this today and to celebrate our 5th birthday here at the UN. I think what I would like to say about dementia is that we do need a 21st century view of dementia. I think that healthcare professionals generally still see dementia from the view of a 20th century. They even families still think of, and civil society thinks of people with dementia at end stage. And if we are diagnosing people, even older persons, at an earlier stage in the disease, and certainly the research community is working very hard to do that because they believe that part of the reason they may have not found a cure yet is they've been having research participants whose disease stage is too late, and so they're wanting to research even at the prodromal stage for dementia. So people are being diagnosed earlier, and people can be supported with disability support to maintain independence for longer. And there are people like Christine and myself, and literally thousands of us around the world now, who are not frightened. Younger people, young, I'm 61 nearly, so I'm still young. Anyone under 100 is young. I thought we seek an earlier diagnosis because we're not as stigmatised about or as fearful of having dementia, and therefore we just need to be supported as persons with acquired disabilities. So I thank you all. I ask if there are any member states or government people in the room, policymakers, to please consider rehabilitation and disability services and support for people with dementia in your countries. Thank you very much for attending.